Thanks very much, and thanks very much for inviting me to give a talk in this in your talk series. So actually, I hope that it works, that you can at least see a bit the slides. So if you cannot really follow the slides, then please let me know. So I will show you some studies we did during the last years, and I think it's important, yeah, to say that all the studies I did during the last years in East Africa, it's a compilation of different activities. And we did this together with mainly with the National Museums of Kenya. It's a very nice, beautiful place with excellent researchers, with Kenyan researchers. And here I worked together with Moses Mulva and with Ronald Mulva and with Onesmus Kyoko. And all these people are excellent ornithologists. So they went with me in the field, and we developed together study designs and collected a lot of data. So we started like almost 20 years ago, actually. And step by step, we put a nice puzzle together. And I want to show you today 3 areas where we did our studies. So the title, it's Birds in East African Forest Islands, Community Ecology and Population Viability. And here you can already see that it will be definitely a talk about forest birds. It will be mainly about forest patches and small forest remnants. And you can also see that on the one hand, we are looking for community structures, population structures, but we are also doing some studies in the field of population genetics and behavior with telemetry studies and so on. So on the first slide here, you can see a map, a global map of the world, and we did a study about the predictions of the hotspot areas. And maybe you know this. It's an approach in the conservation biology field, defining hotspot areas in the world. And when you are traveling to Africa, you definitely have a lot of hotspot areas with many endemic species, endemic plant species, and accumulation of biodiversity. And therefore, it's always a lot of fun and very interesting to work in East Africa, for example. And I marked this area here with this reddish circle. This is actually the area where we did our studies during the last years intensively. On the one hand, it's the Eastern Upper Montane biodiversity hotspot. On the other hand, it's the forest areas along the coastline, the Eastern African coastal forest. It's another biodiversity hotspot area. So it's really fascinating there. So, and let's go ahead on the next slide. You can see our study areas. And we will travel a bit through Kenya, and I will present you 3 study areas and 3 study approaches, but all are on birds, of course, and all are more or less about small forest patches and how the birds are surviving in these small patches. And here you can see, for example, this is a map of Kenya, the southeastern part of Kenya. So we are starting our travel with the Taita Hills. Taita Hills, you can see on the right, a first picture. Taita Hills is a very impressive area where you have a lot of cloud forest. In former times, still intact, largely covered. In the meanwhile, most of the cloud forest was destroyed and transferred into agricultural land and also tree plantations. So here you can see, for example, one mountain area in the Taita Hills, but also the Chulu Hills. All these are these mountain areas. And we did studies. Actually, this was the beginning in 2008. We started a study on the evolution and conservation biology of bird species on these, let's say, sky islands, because the mountains are like islands, and on each mountain top, you have a lot of specific bird species which are living there, which evolved there. And we wanted to learn more about evolution processes, but also about the current status of the birds living in these areas. So let's start with a first study we did, and maybe you know this bird. It's Zosterops polyogaster. It's a mountain white-eye mountain bird species. They are occurring only in the higher elevations in East Africa, but also in other areas. And we wanted to study, and we studied the genetic structure of the mountain white-eyes, which are living on isolated mountain blocks. So in Taita Hills, for example, but also in the central Kenyan highlands, also in the northern mountain areas, in the northern part of Kenya and Ethiopia and so on. So I think you know more or less the procedure. You go in the field with your mist nets, and we spent really weeks in these mountain cloud forests. And we used the mist nets collecting the birds and catching the birds and collecting blood samples. And maybe we start just on the right side. Let's start with the nice pictures here. You can already see all these are Zosterops polyogaster. It's the mountain white-eye, but morphologically they are looking very different. So the upper picture, it's from Mount Kulal. It's an isolated mountain in the northern part of Kenya. You can see the eye rings are very, very small actually. Then here you can see in the middle, you can see Zosterops polyogaster from Chulu Hills. They are looking really bright and yellowish and really very beautiful. And then not far distant from Chulu Hills, we have the Taita Hills, another mountain block. Again, Zosterops polyogaster, again, a lot of differences, huge eye rings, and then a rather grayish belly. So we realized that morphologically, and also from the plumage coloration, but also from the structures and the patterning and so on, they are looking very, very, very different. And we were very surprised. So therefore, we started collecting blood samples, and we did a first analysis together with Sharon Cox. It's the first author here on this paper. We analyzed DNA sequences, mitochondrial DNA, nuclear DNA sequences. And here you have on this map our sampling design. So we have, for example, in Tanzania, we have some samples from the Usambara Mountains, then from Taita Hills, from the mountain areas, and so on, going up to Mount Kulal. It's in the northern part of Kenya, where we have an isolated mountain, very fascinating area. It's always very advantage, and that was very interesting. So what you can see here is, on the left side, a phenogram, a tree, a neighbor joining tree, showing you genetic distances between these different populations, And you can see that sometimes the mountain populations like Taita Hills and Chulu Hills, they are geographically quite close to each other, but they are genetically very far distant from each other. And in the same time, where you have also opposite situations, for example, here, that Mount Kenya and Mount Kulal, we have populations which are far distant, but genetically they are very similar. So it's really difficult to say how these differences evolved. And then in the next step, we also used the dates of the mountain areas, and for example, Taita Hills is a very old mountain area. It's more related to the Usambara Mountains. And Chulu Hills, for example, is a rather recent mountain area. So we think that in these mountain populations, the age of these mountains counts a lot in respect of the differentiation processes in Zostrop's Polyaugusta. And maybe just one take-home message from this side. The morphology and the genetic differentiation patterns do not really fit with each other. So we have different drivers here. And also with the genetics, I think it would be good to do much more on this species complex. I want to show you another picture. This is based on microsatellites. It's another marker from the field of population genetics. And here again, you can see that all these mountain populations from Zostrop's Polyaugusta, from this mountain white-eye, they are very different from each other. Here we have the Tanzania Usambara mountain populations, Taita Hills, Chulu Hills. Actually, the strongest genetic split we found was between Chulu Hills and Taita Hills, and they are very close to each other, but the age is actually very different. So in respect of genetics, morphology, I think there's still a lot to do. It's a very impressive species complex to work with. And I want to show you another approach because we realized, okay, with the genetic structures and also with the morphological structures, it's very hard to really find a clear explanation. So in the next step, we did some studies with bioacoustics. Maybe also you know a bit this approach. So we went in the field working with recordings. So we recorded the song patterns of these birds together with my colleague here. You can see Onesmus Kioko. He's a very good colleague and friend from the National Museums of Kenya. And so we revisited again all these mountain areas and the populations and recorded the birds and the song patterns. And we analyzed the sonograms of all these songs of the birds. And I want to show you just one result. We start with the result here on the above. We can see that the song patterns of these populations, of the mountain populations, they are very different. So here we have Mount Kulal, we have Mount Kasigau, we have all these different mountain populations. And actually, when we compare the song patterns of these mountain Zostrop's Polyaugusta populations with the lowland white-eye species like Zostrop's senegalensis, then we can see they are singing more or less all the same. So when we are traveling across Kenya, we are recording the songs in the lowland and in the highland. Then we receive a cluster here for all the lowland populations and of Zostrop's senegalensis, and they are singing more or less all the same kind of songs. And when we are going in the highland populations, we can see a strong differentiation here between the local populations which are sitting on the mountaintops. And we have a very similar pattern here. It's just displayed in another way. Here at the beginning, you can see these are all the song patterns of the lowland populations of the lowland species. And they are all more or less the same. And then when we are going in the highland areas, they are very different from each other. So they developed, evolved very distinct song patterns from mountain block to mountain block, from mountain population to mountain population, which is, again, I think, very interesting. Okay, so this was our first approach working with birds in East Africa. It was a project which was going on for 2, 3, 4 years about white eyes. And I think the main message here is that Tostrops polyogaster, the mountain white eye, shows a lot of differentiation, a lot of differences in between of all these local occurrences. I would not say that all these are distinct species. There would be more analysis needed, but there's a lot of differentiation within these species, or it's maybe rather a species complex. Okay, then during our visits in these cloud forests, we realized that actually there's a lot of anthropogenic pressure. Unfortunately, all these cloud forests are rather small remnants, small patches of cloud forest. And it's a really sad story, actually. For example, in Taita Hills in the southern part of Kenya, we have a situation that about 2, 3, 4% of the historical cloud forest cover is still there. So means in turn that 90 or 95, 59, 90% or even more of the cloud forest is destroyed in the meanwhile. So here you can see a picture. This is one section of the Taita Hills. And this is a typical situation. Maybe you know Petri Pelika. Petri Pelika, he's a remote sensor from the University of Helsinki. And he studied since many, many years. He's in Taita Hills in the southern part of Kenya and analyzing how the land cover changes are going on. And here you can just see this is one forest patch which is still remaining in the Taita Hills. It's the Chavia forest. And you can also see even from the 50s until 2004, a lot of transformations was going on. For example, all these areas which are here in yellowish, this is a transformation from indigenous forest into agricultural land. So maybe this is another important take-home message maybe for you in Taita Hills. On the one hand, we have these destructions and transformations into agricultural land, maybe mainly for subsistence agriculture. On the other hand, also a transformation into tree plantations. Still, eucalyptus, it's very prominent there. And the restoration of forests in these areas, it's very difficult to really do. Okay, maybe we skip this and we just continue with a community study in Taita Hills. I already mentioned this, that in these cloud forest areas, when we were looking for our white-eye populations, we realized that there's a lot of destruction going on. And there are very, very small remnant patches, remnant habitats of cloud forest, which are still there, but they are very small. And we had big luck collaborating with Luc Lenz. Maybe you know also Luc Lenz. He's a very famous birder and researcher from Ghent University. And he, together with also Kenyan researchers and students, they did a lot of ornithological studies in Taita Hills. So we compiled our data with his huge data set. And here you can see, maybe we start with this graph, area and species richness. And this is a typical situation when you have when we have the different sizes of the remaining forest. In the larger areas, we have a rather high diversity. In the smaller patches, we have lower bird diversity. I think it's not surprising, but nevertheless, it's again a very important evidence to say that we need also large conservation areas to really conserve a large amount of biodiversity, of bird diversity in these forests. Of course, the larger the forest patch, the more resources available, the more ecological niches available, and the higher the diversity of the species. So this is a typical species area ratio, also valid for these last cloud forest remnants in the Taita Hills. And then in the second step in the studies, we grouped a bit the species into frugivorous birds, insectivorous, granivorous, and omnivorous birds. And we checked for feeding guild and also the size of the patch. And we realized that for larger patches, we have a high diversity in insectivorous birds. These are the grayish bars here. These are the situations in the high quality, large forest patches. So here we have a significant signal that when we have small patches, the level of diversity of insectivorous birds is much lower, also for the frugivorous birds, also somehow for granivorous birds. And when we are looking for omnivorous organisms, omnivorous birds, which are eating different resources, we have not this signal. And I think it's very important to realize this. It's not just for birds. It's, I think, a very general ecological message that not all species are responding in the same way. And the more sensitive the species are, the more stronger is the effect. Yeah, and omnivorous birds, or we could even say generalist bird species, they are also still prominent in low quality patches. But specialized bird species are vanishing, especially when we have small patches, when we have low when we have a low habitat quality. Okay, so this was the first step. We went in the what we did in the cloud forest areas, and now we move to the coastal region. So everybody who knows Kenya also knows that Kenya is a very beautiful country with many different ecosystems, many different forest ecosystems, and yeah, the areas are really very interesting. So here we have the Taita Hills. This is a move to the coastal area. It's close to Mombasa. Most of you might know Mombasa. It's a big city, and then in the north we have Kilifi, and there we have also a partnering university, Pwani University, and close by there's a forest. It's the Arabuko-Sokoke coastal forest. It's a very impressive forest. Here you can see it's a picture of the Arabuko-Sokoke coastal forest. And it's still a quite large forest patch. And here I would like to show you a bit about studies about habitat heterogeneity and empty forests. What means empty forests? Here, maybe you would say the forest looks really beautiful, very large forest areas, but when you are going deeper into detail, deeper into the forest, and look for specific habitat structures, then you realize that at a certain point, it's starting to get an empty forest. Means that some resources are no more available because inside of the forest we have a selective logging of hardwood timber, for example, of specific trees. So when you are flying with your airplane over such a forest, you would say everything is perfect. But when you are looking in more detail, you realize there's a lot of disturbances in the forest, which is also very sad. So just to have a look here, some pictures. We went there together with many students. You can see here, we did some studies on insects, of course, as well, but also with birds. I will present you 1-2 studies with birds we did there. And here you can see, I think this is also maybe a very important information for you when you are traveling to Arabuko-Sokoke forest, you will realize you find many, many different forest types within one forest block. So here, for example, you can see this is the Cyanometra forest. It's rather a thicket. And you can see here it's a Prahistegia forest, and you have mixed forest and so on. So you have different forest types, also depending the soil condition. You can see here a sandy soil, and then here you can see the alluvial soils and so on. So, and of course, then you have the differences in the vegetation structure, and you have differences in the entire forest structure. So let's come to a nice study there in Arabuko-Sokoke forest. The Sokoke pipit, for example, it's a very fascinating bird species, but there's also a nocturnal bird, the Sokoke Scopes owl. Sokoke Scopes owl. Sokoke Scopes owl is a very small, I would say, I think it's the smallest owl species of East Africa, maybe of the entire Africa. It's a very small nocturnal bird, Scopes owl, and the population, unfortunately, it's strongly decreasing. Yeah, it's a pity. And we wanted to know more about the habitat demands of the species. What is the Sokoke Scopes owl really needing that it can survive? And we did, together with our colleagues from the National Museums of Kenya, Onesmus Kyoko, but also with some students, Yvonne and Camillo, they stayed for many, many nights inside the forest observing this owl species over many nights. So it was really a hard work, I would say, yeah. And this is one of the results I want to show. Maybe we start with the picture. You can see on the first picture above, the owl species, they have different morphs and so on, reddish and a darkish and so on. Really beautiful animals, very fascinating animals. Then a typical habitat structure and the entire Arabuko-Sokoke forest. And yeah, I already mentioned we did telemetry studies. This means we caught the owls and we put small transmitters on the back, very light transmitters, of course, because also the owl is a very rather small bird species. And we observed them over time. We observed the owls over time, and we realized that they have really distinct territories, and they have very restricted home ranges. And you can see here, this is just for a section of animals. We observed around about 20 owl individuals, and we found out that they have really very distinct territories. These are the home ranges, the kernels 50 and 90% home ranges. And you can see here, I hope you can see it, black dots. And all these are roosting trees. So we realized, actually with the help of David Ngala, another very famous conservationist in Kenya, we found out that each single Scopes owl individual is visiting different roosting trees. So they are changing their roosting trees from night to night or from day to day, where they are roost during the day, but they are all somehow centered. And all the roosting trees are inside of dense thicket and mostly in very large Cyanometra trees. And this is actually the main conflict in Arabuko-Sokoke, in the Arabuko-Sokoke forest, that the big Cyanometra trees are also sometimes cut by people for house constructions and different things. So here we have a big conflict. So this is just a result based on the telemetry analysis. And this is our results out of the habitat models. And here you can also see that what do they really need that they can that they are occurring in an area. They need dead trees, dead wood, They need old and large cyanometra trees and dense thicket and so on. So these are the habitat demands. And I think it's maybe another, and here on the right side you can see, so this is a typical habitat of this owl species, a really dense thicket forest. And below you can see this is a typical situation, selective cutting of hardwood timber, of hardwood trees. Yeah, and this is very unfortunate, not only for this owl species, but in general, yeah. So the main take-home message here, I would say, is that it's very important to go deeper in an ecosystem and to check how is the habitat quality inside of this forest, inside of an ecosystem. So it's not just the presence or absence of a forest, it's also the habitat quality with which matters a lot, that specific species can still occur there. Okay, let's travel to the third area, study area, and this is in a dry area, the so-called Ukambani region. Maybe some of you know a bit the region where the Kamba people are living. A very fascinating area. We have dry savanna situations. It's a rather dry area with some streams. And actually, we did a collaboration also with the Southeastern Kenya University there, SEKU, and we worked along gallery forests. Actually, I find here you can see this is Nseu River. Nseu River, it's a very beautiful, actually a very beautiful landscape, a very beautiful area. It's nice. And in this area, you have sometimes water in the riverbeds. It's yeah, still with gallery forest sometimes, but actually most of the gallery forest is no more available. Yeah, it's a pity, actually, really a pity that. But of course, I also understand the situation. I mean, the people are settling mainly along these rivers, destroying most proportion of the vegetation, of the original vegetation, and using these areas for planting their vegetables and so on. So this is just maybe some aspects. I think it's important to understand. Yeah, we have the high demographic pressure there. We have reduced soil fertility, land splitting, climate change effect, also a big problem. And then, of course, we have rather fragile ecosystems. And we also realized when the people are cutting the gallery forests along these rivers, then in the next step, they often plant vegetables and different things. And then afterwards, sometimes they do not use it anymore. And then it's not the case that the riparian forest is coming back. Then it's rather the case that invasive species are growing there. And Lantana camara, for example, Lantana camara is covering major proportion of this river border, yeah, which is a pity. So let's show you some activities there also with birds. So we worked in this area first with drones because we wanted to know more about the land cover situation and the habitats which are still there. And it was also very interesting. This was also like 10 years ago when we worked with some small drones, Phantom 2 and Phantom 4 small drones. And we assessed the land cover situation. And I want to show you the situation, how it was some decades ago. This is the Nseu River in the Ukambani region. And the greenish area are the pristine riparian forests, which were still intact and which were still there some decades ago. In the meanwhile, the situation is like that. these dots represent huts or settlement areas. So in the meanwhile, you have a lot of settlement activities along these rivers. And these greenish areas, which you can see still here in this situation, vanished more or less completely. And this means that the riparian forests are today very small remnants, very small remaining patches. And we were looking for birds living along these rivers, living in these riparian forest remnants. And just to show you some impressions, this is, for example, some students doing telemetry studies. Here is a student with Heinz Babler Turdois hindi, a very rare bird species, very fascinating bird species. They are cooperative breeders. They are foraging together. They are living as a family group and breeding as a family group somehow. Also here, I think a lot of more research would be really nice to do on these fascinating bird species. Yeah, so a lot of work. Actually, here you can see Lantana camara around. Everything is full with Lantana camara. It's a very, I would say it's a big problem because it's causing a homogenization of vegetation along all these rivers, which is really bad for many organisms. Not only birds, many insects. Yeah. Okay, so telemetry studies in these areas, we started first with telemetry studies on the Heinz Babler, this cooperative breeder, and we found for this bird species also distinct territories. Yeah, here you can see on the, maybe we start on the right side, you can see the pictures. Here on the right side upper, you see Heinz Babler sitting, one individual in a dense thicket. So they are also frequently can be observed in the lantana shrubs. So they are maybe even using these lantana shrubs as a kind of a novel ecosystem where they are living. And here below, you can see this is the main problem, burning bricks in this area. It's very famous. Everybody is doing this. And of course, when you are burning such bricks, you use the big trees, you produce charcoal to burn these bricks and so on. Yeah, so it's a, yeah, I would say it's a big problem because it's causing a complete destruction of the entire ecosystem. Nevertheless, we still can find these interesting bird species. And here you can see, for example, group 4, group 3, group 6, and so on. So the Heinz Babler is living in family groups. They have more or less spatially restricted territories along this river. Here you can see bluish identified a bit. You can see this is the river going along through the landscape. And they are more or less avoiding human disturbance or human presence areas. Yeah. And based on the informations about how they are moving, in which habitats they are mainly found, we did some models, habitat distribution models, as you can see here. This is a section of the Ukambani region of this landscape. You can see here the rivers, and you can see here in reddish, these are areas with a high suitability of the habitat. So dense thickets, which are still available. Sometimes it's still there, but sometimes, as you can see here along this river or this other rivers, the suitable habitats are really small and geographically isolated from each other. This might be somehow a problem. Okay, and during our activities there with the Heinz Babler, we realized that there are much more different bird species around living there and using the ecosystems. And therefore, we did, let's say, 5 years telemetry campaign with many, many different bird species. And just to show you some and one last result. So these are the typical bird species which are common there, like the African black-headed oriole, bare-eyed thrush, common bulbul, and so on. Here we have, by the way, we have the Heinz babbler, and we grouped our bird species into, let's say, guilds or traits or whatever. For example, here you can see all these birds which are in black, like the African black-headed oriole or bare-eyed thrush and so on. These are rather open landscape savanna species. Then on the other side, we have typical forest or forest-like bird species like the Heinz babbler, but also the tropical boo and the robin jet. And then we also used or checked for what are they feeding. For example, some are insectivorous, others are frugivorous, and then some are just eating everything, rather omnivorous. And I want to show you one last result out of these groupings and these telemetry studies. We analyzed, for example, the home ranges of these bird species in this highly degraded environment. And also here we found out that they are responding very differently to the same landscape. So what you can see here is the response on habitat fragmentation, specialist versus generalist, and the feeding behavior. So we have grouped into frugivorous species, insectivorous bird species, and omnivorous bird species. And we can see here the home ranges, for example, for all these birds in the respective groups. And then we can see that, for example, these omnivorous birds, they show the largest home ranges. Means that they are migrating through the landscape, they are kind of responding, they are looking for food and so on. So they have really big home ranges. Most of them even do not have territories, they are just moving around. And the others, rather the specialist species like the insectivorous birds and so on, they show rather restricted home ranges. And I think this is very important to consider. Again, here, maybe in general, just to say that species are responding very differently to the same landscape situation. Some are coping very well with degradation processes. Others are really having a big problem with these trends. Okay, let's do a summary. Actually, I just do it in English, and then maybe somebody can translate into into French language. So mountain wide-eye evolution in East African cloud forests. I showed you that there's a lot of differentiation, and there are still many open questions. I think there's still also a research activity going on in the lab of Luc Lenz, Zosterop's genomics or something like that, working about Zosterop's evolution processes. Nevertheless, yeah, I think it's a very interesting species complex, and we should definitely learn more about how they evolved and when they split into all these distinct population clusters and maybe subspecies or something like that. Then I tried to show you effects of forest fragmentation on bird diversity. And here we can see on the one hand genetic signatures, but especially I showed you this situation in Taita Hills on the community level. We can see larger patches are still provide a larger number of bird species. Small forest patches, degraded forest patches, show a rather low level of community diversity, lower number of species diversity. Then I try to explain there's a high relevance of habitat quality for sensitive, for specialist, for endemic bird species. And I think, yeah, this is very important to realize that for the Sokoke scopes owl, for example, in the Arabuko Sokoke forest, it's not just the presence of a forest. We also have to consider the structures inside the forest with specific resources which are available, deadwood availability, tall, old trees which are there where they can roost and so on. So I think habitat quality is very, very important. And I try to explain this with this very fascinating owl species. Yeah, and then our last section about the riparian forest species ecology affects movement ecology in birds of East African riparian forests. Here I tried to explain you how they are acting in a degraded environment. Sometimes they are using even invasive plant species. Heinz Babler, for example, we found them very often foraging, eating in hidden in these Lantana camara thickets. But of course, other species cannot cope with such transformation processes. Okay, actually that's it. 3 areas where we worked in Kenya, fascinating country, very impressive and kind people. And yeah, I would like to thank Ronald Mulva, Onesmus Kyoko, and Moses Mulva. They are all working in the National Museums of Kenya. They are excellent ornithologists, and we are collaborating since long. And it's always very fruitful collaborating with them together. And also, I would thank to Mike Teuscher. Mike Teuscher is a collaborator, a colleague of mine from the University of Halle in Germany. He is doing a lot of remote sensing, and we did our first drone work in Kenya like 10 years ago, which was also very interesting and very good. Then for fun, German Academic Exchange Service, and thank you very much for listening.
Bonjour à tous. Alors, on va faire une petite traduction en français. Donc, c'était une présentation sur les oiseaux des îlots de forêt d'Afrique de l'Est, l'écologie des communautés et la viabilité des populations dans cet habitat par monsieur le professeur Jean-Christian Habel, de l'Université de Salzburg en Autriche. Tout d'abord, on a parlé des collines de taïta et de l'évolution et la conservation des espèces de montagne, avec des ostérops qui ont différents patterns de chant dans chaque région de montagne, qui sont eux-mêmes différents de l'espèce de plaine qu'on trouve dans les régions voisines. Ensuite, le professeur a parlé de la pression anthropogénique et de la destruction des habitats dans ces forêts de montagne, avec une forte fragmentation. On a vu que la diversité des oiseaux frugivores et insectivores, ainsi que des granivores, est moindre dans les petites reliques forestières. Par contre, les espèces omnivores sont moins affectées. Et que, donc, en général, l'effet de la fragmentation est plus important sur les espèces sensibles. Ensuite, on a parlé des régions côtières, avec une hétérogénéité des habitats forestiers et des différences de qualité d'habitat et de structure d'habitat au sein des mêmes forêts qui sont importantes pour les oiseaux qui y vivent. Donc, par exemple, le pipit de Sokoke et le petit duc d'Irène qui a été étudié plus en détail. Le petit duc d'Irène a une utilisation du territoire distinct selon les activités, par exemple des arbres dortoirs qui se trouvent dans des endroits plus denses. Et ces arbres du genre Cynometra sont souvent coupés par les gens pour faire leur maison ou différentes choses. Il est important d'aller contrôler la qualité de l'habitat au sein de la forêt et pas uniquement la présence de forêt, puisqu'il peut y avoir différentes qualités d'habitat. Donc, c'était ça le principal message. Ensuite, il y avait un 3e site d'étude dans une région du sud-est du Kenya où on trouve des forêts riveraines dans une région plus sèche, où il y a donc une grande partie des forêts-galeries le long des cours d'eau sont endommagées. Ces endroits sont utilisés par l'agriculture. Il y a une pression démographique croissante et des problèmes avec les espèces invasives comme la Lantana camara, qui recouvre le sol et empêche les plantes indigènes de se développer. Donc, il y a eu un travail qui a été fait avec des drones pour mesurer cette fragmentation d'habitat qui sont donc avec le temps de plus en plus petits et isolés. Et ensuite, on a vu des photos de ces étudiants et des études télémétriques sur le cratérope de Hind. C'est une espèce qui vit en groupes familiaux avec des conflits avec l'utilisation du territoire par les êtres humains. La connectivité des habitats donc, est limitante pour cette espèce selon les études. Et il y a d'autres espèces aussi qu'ils ont découvert qui vivent dans cet habitat et donc ils ont décidé de faire de la télémétrie avec certaines d'entre elles. Le domaine vital de ces espèces dans ces habitats dégradés a été étudié. Et donc il y a une réponse différente selon les espèces ou les groupes d'espèces à ce problème de dégradation de l'habitat. Donc je ne vais pas refaire le résumé, je pense que c'était déjà un résumé. Merci pour votre attention et n'hésitez pas à poser des questions.